Hello everyone. I recently completed Persona 4 Golden, and I definitely have a lot to say in it, so this video will serve as my complete opinion on the game as a whole. Persona 4, in case you don't know, is a murder mystery, and I will be discussing the entire mystery with all the curveballs and the correct culprit, so I highly recommend that if you've not completed the game, and you want to see the true culprit for yourself, I highly recommend coming back to this video after you've beaten it. I'll also be discussing some of the spoilery stuff in Persona 5, so be warned for that as well. The way I'll be formatting this video is very similar to how I formatted my Persona 5 video. I'll split each major part of the game into its own section, and talk about them individually. The sections I will be covering in order are the story, the characters, the combat, the dungeons, the daily life, and some extra stuff I want to throw in. But before we get into it, if you like the video here today and you want to see more Fire Emblem and Persona content in the future, like and subscribe. With all that done, however, let's get into my complete opinion on Persona 4 Golden. Just like my Persona 5 video, I'll be discussing my opinions on the story through the little arcs throughout the game. For example, the part where Yukiko is in the TV realm until she gets out, and then moves on to Kanji, those are both two separate arcs. Then I'll go through basically everything that happens in that arc and give my opinion on it, including my theories at the time on who the killer was. Persona 4 does not start out with a bang like Persona 5 did, but it did a really good job of setting up stuff that will become important as the mystery goes along. Heck, the opening scene when the main character first reaches Inaba is very important, and it sets up a lot of future plot points for the mystery to come. From the first couple interactions, you were introduced to Marie, a mysterious girl who helps pick up something you dropped, but doesn't really seem that interested in you. And obviously she becomes really important to the plot later on in the story, but very end of the story. You are also introduced to the very normal gas station attendant who shakes your hand and offers you a part-time job at the gas station. She, of course, unbeknownst to me, and I honestly forgot about her as the game went along, became very important in the mystery as a whole. After you shake the gas station attendant's hand, you start to feel queasy and sick, but it's obviously brushed off, as it would be kinda obvious if they brought too much attention to it, as the main point of that scene was to make you pay more attention to Dojima and Nanako, the father and daughter whose house you'll be staying in throughout the game. I appreciate this scene so much because it doesn't really seem like that important of a scene when you first play it, and most players, including myself, will likely forget about it as you get into the Midnight Channel stuff. But it does a lot to put in clues about the mystery and the killings before the mystery and the killings even start. This arc also shows off a lot of the main characters. Obviously, they already showed off Dojima, Nanako, the main character, and Marie, but they also mentioned Namatame, Adachi shows up, and 5 future party members show up, 3 of which obviously join your party in this arc. Obviously, due to the theme of the game, all 3 party members have to face themselves before they're allowed to join your party and receive their persona. Yosuke had to accept that part of the reason why he wanted to investigate the murder so bad wasn't just to avenge Saki Konishi, the girl he liked, but also so he could become the hero and everyone will respect him. And because there was nothing else to do in Inaba. GA's other self revolves around her feeling less feminine than Yukiko, who all the boys at school like, and possibly feeling some resentment toward Yukiko because of it. The main one for this arc, Yukiko, centers around her wanting to escape her inn as she feels forced into it, so she really just wants someone to come and rescue her and take her out of Inaba, which is evident as her castle shows her being Princess Yukiko searching for a Prince Charming, and her dungeon being a castle. But as shown through her social link, she was never really obligated to join the inn, and she really just forced that pressure upon herself. I think out of all these Persona awakenings, Yosuke's was the strongest. His just was the most impactful, as it came right after Saki Kunishi's death, which had obviously hit him pretty hard, and Saki Kunishi saying she hated him right before he awakened probably also didn't make things better. I think Yukiko was his second best. Since she was the first one to actually be thrown into the TV that you were able to save, she obviously was better than Chie's, but I do think that the stuff her shadow self said wasn't really that surprising, and I obviously could pick it up compared to some of the other ones which were completely surprising, as I'll get to later. But like Yosuke's, Yukiko's Persona Awakening was a nice setup to her character development and her social link. Out of the 3, Chie's was probably the weakest. Not because it was super bad, but as I'll cover more in my character section, Chie just wasn't my favorite, so it was kinda hard to emotionally resonate with her overcoming her shadow. Yukiko's arc definitely wasn't as strong as Kamoshida's in Persona 5, but it did a really good job creating intrigue for the mystery and setting up a lot of key plot points. As of this time, I had no theories on the killer. It was way too early in the game for me to make any theories at all, so obviously I didn't have anyone in mind. After Yukiko is rescued, the investigation crew comes to the realization that they believe that all the victims of the murder case will be female and somehow be connected to the first victim. Of course, like with any good mystery, that notion is completely thrown out of the window when Kanji Tatsumi gets kidnapped. Kanji is shown before he gets kidnapped to be the typical tough guy who doesn't really like anyone and just gets in random fights. Obviously, since I knew Kanji would be a party member at some point due to him being in the opening movie and on the cover of the game, but I figured most of his character development in the story would be around him learning to be a nicer guy and let go some of that tough guy personality trait. But unlike Yukiko, when he showed up on the Midnight Channel, oh boy. He shows up on the Midnight Channel of the leader of a show for a males-only bathhouse. If I were someone who had never played Persona before or never even heard of it, I'd probably think it's pretty weird, but that's kind of the whole point of a shadow self, to be the extreme proportions of someone that they kind of hide away. Kanji's shadow self revolves around him feeling insecure since he likes the more feminine stuff like sewing, so the girls at the school bullied him and the boys at the school ostracized him. So he went on and pretended to be a thug, which he wasn't, so that people would distance himself from him and he would have control over it. Because in reality, Kanji's actually a very nice guy. I think out of the Persona Awakenings we've seen so far, Kanji was definitely the strongest in my eyes, since he completely surprised me with what his character was going to be. The game did a great job of making me initially feel that Kanji was just going to be a standard thug, just like all the characters in the game at the time. After you rescue Kanji, you realize that your previous notion about all of the characters being kidnapped or being girls were completely incorrect, because obviously Kanji is a guy. So that creates another curveball in solving the mystery, which will happen more and more throughout the story. This arc was probably stronger than Yukiko's in terms of pure story-based for a first-time playthrough. Obviously, it didn't give as many hints for the true killer's identity as Yukiko's, since Yukiko had the benefit of being at the beginning of the game, but I think I enjoyed it slightly more, just based on the surprise of Kanji's character. And lastly, I still did not have any predictions about the killer. Risei's arc is probably the weakest one so far. While it's not bad, it definitely isn't as memorable as the rest of the story. The next person to go into the TV world is Risei, but before she even gets kidnapped, the most obvious red herring shows up and Adachi arrests him. I'm assuming it's just a red herring for the characters in the game, as it'd be kinda weird if the killer ended up to be a nameless NPC with no character portrait that only shows up once before he's arrested. But that red herring basically ties itself up 5 minutes later as Risei is kidnapped. And similarly to Kanji, her shadow is definitely, interesting. Ignoring the visual symbolism of her dungeon and shadow, basically her shadow about her character is that she's trying to repress the Rosette part of her personality, saying that's not real and it's only for on-screen. Due to the fact that her job as an idol requires to exaggerate parts of her personality. Risei's dungeon is definitely one of the weirdest to play through. I already thought that Kamoshida's dungeon in Persona 5 is a little bit weird. This one is definitely weirder. I mean, it's not overly graphic or anything, but the dungeon is a striptease, and that's as bluntly as I can put it. But inside that dungeon, Risei isn't the only one to awaken to her persona. Teddy does as well. His inner worries about not having an actual backstory to remember, and that he really just was a shadow from the TV world, reach its maximum after Risei awakens to her persona. Shadow Teddy essentially puts that Teddy is hollow and nothing, and really that they will never solve the mystery as fog will continue to envelop the case. Which later in the story becomes not just a metaphor, but also literal as fog envelops Inaba. But maybe it's because I'm not a big fan of Teddy, but I think his Persona Awakening is the weakest in the entire game. Mainly for the reason that throughout the entire game before this arc, he'd been telling people not to reject their shadows, and to accept it so they don't have to fight it. But then he does the same thing. I mean, whatever's whatever, but I've already seen the animal creature searching for himself moment in a Persona game with Morgana in Persona 5. I mean, I get that Persona 4 came out before, but, and I can't believe I'm saying this, Morgana did it better. I feel like there's a lot more hints towards Morgana's identity than there was for Teddy. So that kind of leaves Teddy's shadow and Teddy's whole reveal in general just feeling kind of lackluster in comparison. But once Risei is rescued, the gang finally comes to the conclusion that their previous notions are completely false, as Risei has no connection to the first victim. But even as Risei is rescued, someone still ends up dead the following day. Yes, Mitsuo's arc definitely starts out with a plot twist. The homeroom teacher King Moron dying was definitely a shocker. Sure, the principal also died in Persona 5, but that wasn't really for a shocking moment, it was really just a setup for later in the game. But with his death, it wasn't really hinted at all beforehand, it just kinda happened. Then someone shows up on the Midnight Channel clear as day saying he's the killer. Mitsuo Kobo, the guy that hit on Yukiko at the beginning of the game. All the pieces were connecting. They finally found the killer, right? Yeah, I never thought it was Mitsuo. It was way too early in the game for it to end, because I knew at least one more party member was going to join, based on the game's cover art and the opening movie. And it'd be kinda weird if a murder mystery game didn't let you guess on who the killer was, along with the fact that he had almost no build-up before he showed up. All of those reasons made him the second most obvious red herring of all time. But I'm just gonna assume that's only a red herring for the characters again. They definitely did a good job of making Mitsuo look really creepy though, I'll give him that. What's cool about this dungeon though is that even after you rescue him from the Midnight Channel, obviously he doesn't end up joining you, since obviously he ends up being arrested by the police. But for the characters in the game, the case is at a standstill since they have to wait for the police to reveal their findings on Mitsuo. So their natural next step is to go mess around at a beach. Finally, after a very long time, I started to theorize on who the killer might be. Around this time, I had 4 people I was kind of considering to be the murderer, but with a grain of salt because I realized that it was only the upper half of the game. Teddy was a little suspicious to me because he had a mysterious origin that he apparently knew nothing about. Of course, I was wrong with this assessment because I had not seen what human Teddy would soon become. Ugh. I was also a little suspicious on Adachi and Dojima, simply because they were the closest related to the case and we see them a lot throughout the game. But then again, I didn't really have much reason behind it other than that. And the one I was most confident out of the 4 was the 4th option, no one I've met yet, because I honestly had no idea. Overall, Mitsuo's arc was really awesome, as it really got me thinking about who the culprit might be, as well as introducing the first major red herring. After a while in-game of waiting the police to make progress with Mitsuo, Naoto Shirogane, the detective boy you met earlier in the game, starts going to your high school. So the investigation team starts hanging out with Naoto during the school trip to Gekukan High School, which is the name of the high school in Persona 3. Since I played Persona 4 before I played Persona 3, the trip to Gekukan was more of a preview for Persona 3 rather than a callback. And I definitely preferred the class trip in Persona 4 compared to Persona 5. I definitely preferred the class trip in Persona 4 compared to Persona 5, since while both class trips did further the story in some way, Persona 4 led directly to the mystery, while basically confirming that Mitsuo only killed King Moron, whereas the one in Persona 5 leads directly to the Okumura arc, which, if you played it, is by far the worst arc in the game. After the class trip is over, Naoto makes one of the most ballsy moves in the entire game. Naoto, who thinks the killer gets his victims based on who shows up on TV in Inaba, literally goes on TV to get kidnapped, which was a great motivator for me to want to do Naoto's social link when I eventually unlocked it. Then surprise, surprise, Naoto gets kidnapped, so you must go into the TV to do another rescue. But what I haven't mentioned before is what her shadow reveals about Naoto, something that was so easy to predict from the first time I met her. Yup, Naoto was just pretending to be a boy, and she's actually a girl the entire time. What? Now, I'm in no way criticizing the game for this reveal. It's just that from the first interaction I had with her all the way back in Kanji's arc, I could tell that the voice actor that portrayed her was definitely a girl. Sure, the argument could have been made that it was just a female voice actor portraying a younger boy, like with Kanemata in Persona 3. But no, Naoto's around the party's age, so I guess my point is, it was completely obvious. All that aside, the reason Naoto pretended to be a boy was so that she wouldn't be discriminated against in her job as a detective, since it's a mostly male-oriented field. And that logic makes a lot of sense for her character. But I do admit that's not my favorite Persona Awakening ever, mostly the fact that the big reveal of her being a girl was obvious. It was still a very good one though. Just like all of the other party members, once she's rescued, she gives new facts about the case. 1, that the killer was male, and 2, that he could kidnap people without arousing suspicion in the night. And with that reveal, I dropped any suspicion of Dojima, mostly because I finished his social link around this time, so I really would be surprised if he ended up being the killer. I also dropped my suspicion of Teddy because if he ended up being the killer, I would drop any praise I have for this game. Because I'll say before and I'll say it again, Teddy is worse than Morgana. So in my mind, there's really only 2 suspects left. Someone I didn't know, or Adachi. I was suspicious of Adachi mostly because I didn't really have anyone else in mind and he was the only one I think could have been it, but I still wasn't too sure. Overall, Naoto's arc was really good. I did see most of the big reveals in this arc coming, but it was still a very solid arc. After this, it moves on to the climax of the game, the Heaven arc. You get no more party members after this, so it's really just devoted solely to the mystery. And to start off, the main character gets a letter from the killer saying that if he rescues anyone, someone very close to him will be put into the TV. Once the main character gets the second letter, his uncle Dojima is looking over his shoulder and takes him down to the police station for questioning. And he won't believe the main character's story regardless if he tells the truth of his involvement in the case, so he forces the main character to stay in it the entire night. But once midnight strikes, the midnight channel lights up with the next victim, Nanako. The following scene of the party trying to get out of there so they could potentially rescue her, while the main character is forced to stay in the police station, is very intense. And when Dojima finally realizes that Nanako is going to be kidnapped next, he tries so desperately to rescue her in a car chase with Namatame, but by then it's too late. It's a very intense scene that honestly gave me goosebumps. The party ends up coming to the conclusion that Namatame must be the killer, since he has a delivery truck with a TV in the back that he used to push Nanako in. It was an incredibly well done scene, and it gave me extreme motivation to want to rescue Nanako and stop Namatame. Nanako's dungeon is by far the saddest in the game. She just wants to see her mother again, who died in the car crash, so her dungeon is aptly named Heaven. It might have something to do with Namatame too, but I'm not 100% sure. Because at the end of the dungeon, you're going to be fighting Namatame. And Namatame is portrayed as a very insane individual. He keeps going on in the game about how he's saving people when he throws them in the TV, and that he's the only one that can save them. But what's cool is that instead of fighting Namatame's shadow like you do for Mitsuo and the other party members, you end up fighting this figure called Kugino Sagiri. It's just another standard boss fight, so I don't really have too much to say on the boss encounter itself, but after you do, Namatame and Nanako both get sent to the hospital. After you rescue Nanako from her dungeon, the game does a good job of giving you a false sense of security, as despite the fact that Dojima and Nanako are in the hospital, you go back to normal life and talking to your social links. And that was the Heaven arc, one of the best arcs in the entire game. This arc excelled at so many things. It had some really powerful moments at the beginning with the car crash scene. It gave you extreme motivation to want to rescue the victim as soon as possible when Nanako was kidnapped, which brought up even more clues about who the murderer could be, as well as a great setup for the next arc where you stop the killer. For the last time, my personal thoughts of the killer at this time was only with one man, Adachi. Sure, I was a little bit confused with Namatame, but I felt like it was Adachi because his personality was very likable. And at this point, I was thinking it would probably end up being someone you'd never expect, so I went with the most likable guy in the game, my favorite character. At the beginning of the killer's arc, Nanako's condition worsens. You rush over to the hospital to try to help her out, but she dies. And then you have to watch Dojima walk in and fall apart because his daughter died, and another really goosebumpy scene. The scene was so heart-wrenching, and even though this game is mostly lighthearted to begin with, it definitely can get serious when it needs to. Despite the fact that Nanako ends up getting revived anyway, it's still a very incredibly well done scene, and it's super sad. After this, the party is fed up. They go up to Namatame's room for an interrogation, and Yosuke is fed up. He suggests that they push him into the DV and let him die in there. Now, this is one of the most crucial scenes in the game, as it will decide if you get the true ending or one of the bad endings. You need to get 7 dialogue choices in a row. All the while, Yosuke is getting mad at you for not agreeing with him, and while I think that the scene is done really well with some great performances, I definitely feel like 7 dialogue choices in a row to get the true ending is a bit much. But if you do get all the dialogue choices right, the investigation team decides to review all the facts before they make any rash decisions, and Nanako survives. After that, the next several days in the game are dedicated to reviewing all your facts and explaining how Namatame isn't the murderer, since he only started putting people in the TV with Yukiko, and he thought putting in the TV would help them be saved. After you review all the facts, you go to the diner, and you have to guess who the murderer actually was. And despite being a very serious scene, one of the funniest moments happened. You can actually accuse Nanako of being the killer, and I laughed pretty hard at that, but obviously I already knew who the killer was. Yep, all along, the killer of Saku Konishi and Mayumi Yamano was my favorite character, Adachi. Looking back on it now, I should have thought it was him from the beginning, simply for the fact that his name is so similar to Akechi from Persona 5. You're actually surprisingly given the option to side with Adachi, which obviously I didn't do, so I'm not going to comment on it. But let's discuss Adachi's motivations. Finding the killer is one thing, but if they don't really have any convincing motivations, then it's kind of for nothing. The thing that's so good about Adachi is that his motivations aren't really that deep like the final boss from Persona 5. He simply kills them because they were bad. He thought they were the bad girls, and he had nothing else better to do in the town, so why not? He just wanted to have some fun in a boring town. His motivations are truly despicable. Even though I still like Adachi's character, it's for definitely different reasons than I initially did. He essentially explains that the first victim he accidentally pushed in, but when he did push her in, he enjoyed it. So, when he saw Saku Konishi talking to Namatame, he decided to push her in because he thought she was just another bad girl. A gold digger, as he reasoned. But after he killed Saku Konishi, he happened to be on the phone with Namatame, so he low-key manipulated him into pushing people in the TV by telling him to push matters into his own hands. And he just watched as Namatame put everyone into the TV that showed up on the Midnight Channel, while Adachi just liked watching on the sidelines. I really appreciate the explanation, as it was thorough, and looking back on it now, it definitely makes sense. But like Mitsuo before him, Adachi challenges the investigation team to come into his dungeon and face him if they dare. They do not have much time though, as around them the fog is slowly creeping up on the world that is traveling over from the Midnight Channel, and if they wait too long, the entire world will be enveloped by fog, and everyone in the world will turn into shadows. The fog section of the game was really creepy. This really eerie music started playing, and everyone got more and more insane, and I definitely waited as long as I can to go into his dungeon, as I kinda wanna see how insane it could get before the game would end. Adachi's Social Link Arcana changes from the Jester to the Hunger Arcana, which was definitely a nice change, since it'd be kinda weird if he had the same Arcana throughout the entire game, especially after you realize he's a killer. Adachi's dungeon is based on the town itself. There's a bunch of police tape all over the dungeon, since Adachi was a detective. When you finally reach the end of the dungeon and get to Adachi, he does a long villainous rant on how the world would be better if everyone was Shadow, as no one really wants the truth to begin with. Then you fight Adachi, whose persona is a darker, more evil version of the protagonist's persona Izanagi. Even after you beat Adachi, the fight's not over, as he turns into the other Sagiri. This Sagiri essentially says the exact same thing as Adachi, so there's not really much to bring up there, but after the fight, he says that if mankind so wishes, he will return to their side, always watching them. And then once you leave the Midnight Channel, you go home and celebrate your victory in capturing the killer. And honestly, that would have been a perfect end to the game. You just caught the killer who you've been chasing the entire game, but nope, there's two arcs left to talk about. Just like with Persona 5, the next arc of the game is completely optional. You only get it if you max a certain character's social link, and it's Marie. Throughout Marie's social link in the game, you're trying to figure out her true identity, and she doesn't figure it out when you max it out, but when January comes around, she does. And she doesn't like the answer she gets, so she runs away and hides in her dungeon. She learned that she served the same purpose of the Sagiris, to bring fog to Inaba, but she was an unwilling participant, so she wanted to go into her dungeon, the Hollow Forest, to die, so that everyone forgets about her, and then fog won't come back to Inaba. And of course, the party is just not having that, so they go in and chase after her. And as obvious as it is, her other self is Kazumi no Okami, and she has to learn to accept who she truly is and not run from her fears. And yeah, this arc honestly isn't that good. It's not terrible or anything, it's pretty slow, as you start it in January, but you don't actually get to go to her dungeon until February 13th, and it's not like it's giving you plenty of new information, you just kinda get it all at once on February 13th. And the big reveal of Marie basically being the unknown collection of the Sagiris, I guess makes sense, but it's not really the payoff I would have wanted. I don't know, I think it's nice that they try to connect it to the murder case, but isn't there a better way they could have done it? Maybe she was a victim of one of the kidnappings but escaped but lost her memory or something. I think that would have worked really well. But they try to make her a big factor in why the Midnight Channel even exists, but they don't really give any hinting for it, like, at all, so it just came out of the blue. Another big part of this arc is just kind of hanging out with your party members, since the main character will be going back to the city in March. So I guess that's an argument you can make for its slower pace, but even still, it doesn't really compare to the third semester at all. But then, just like all the other Persona games, it skips ahead to March and it's on the final day of the game. So you think that'd be it, right? I mean, you stop the killer and learn the truth about Marie, so you'd expect the game just to talk to your social links and then leave. And that's what you start out doing. After you say goodbye to all the social links you maxed out throughout the game, you're asked if you want to go home for the day. And you could say yes. You probably wouldn't even realize that you didn't get the true ending. Thank God that's not what happened to me though. Luckily, I just wanted to talk to some of the NPCs to see what they're gonna say, so I said no. So I went over to Juness, and I clicked on the elevator just to see what would happen if I tried to go back in there. And when I went to the food court, all my party members started showing up. And it starts out pretty normal. You just talk about the good old days when you were solving the case, until one question showed up. Who created the Midnight Channel rumor? Why would that rumor even start to begin with? Then you open up a letter from Adachi, which makes the party question even more how they even learned about it in the first place. So they agree before the main character goes home that they'd find out this last mystery. Once you start talking around town, talking to Dojima and everyone else, as you get closer and closer to the true perpetrator of the entire game's events, the game gets cloudier and foggier until you reach the true perpetrator. Do you remember that gas station attendant you talked to at the beginning of the game that gave you a handshake? Yup, it was her the whole time. She didn't physically do any of the murders, but she gave the powers to the main character, Namatame, and Adachi so the game's events would happen, to essentially prove that people don't actually need the truth and would rather live in blissful ignorance. So she, who is revealed to be the goddess Izanami, bestowed her powers onto the three by shaking their hand. And despite me not liking how it's so easy to miss, I really like this twist. Looking back on it, it's definitely hinted as you feel sick immediately after shaking her hand. What's even cooler is that the dungeon that you fight her in is actually the same one from the dream you had in the beginning of the game. Izanami's main motivations as a villain is to do what she thinks mankind desires, to be rid from finding the truth. And Izanami as a final boss actually works pretty well. The hints about her existence throughout the entire game and her eventual reveal are really well done. Although her villain motivations aren't super deep, I think she works really well as a perpetrator behind everything. There's even a really cool moment in the boss fight where you have to use the item that Igor gave you in the Velvet Room to reveal Izanami's true form, as the form you fought in the first phase was a fake that she construed to hide the truth. It's also revealed that Marie is Izanami's ego, as it is revealed that the comb that Marie has been holding onto was a creation of Izanami. And after that, you finish Izanami off with the power of friendship, which I'll admit is pretty cliche when I put it like that, but the scene is pretty cool anyway. The ending's pretty sweet, as the day you leave for Inaba, your friends chase you down the train as you exit, but then it skips ahead to a different month in the summer, where you come back to Inaba and see how much your friends have changed because of your actions. Because basically all the main cast has unique designs to show how much they've changed throughout the game. Compared to Persona 5 and Persona 3's ending, I think I like this one the least, but still a very good ending that caps off on the themes and characters you've been experiencing throughout the game in a very good way. To cap off this 25-minute plus story section, let's talk about the story as a whole. For a game about a murder mystery, this game has some really funny moments that I quote every day. Just to name a few, Great Vegetables is one of the funniest things I've ever seen. When I saw the Naruto line, "Sorry Teddy, but only people have human rights," I laughed for about 2 minutes after the scene was done. And of course, who could forget, Nanako is the killer. Sure, this game can be cheesy. Sure, there's one character in the game that's so annoying that he can sometimes bring down my enjoyment of a scene just because he's in it. But beneath all that is a great murder mystery story that kept me engaged throughout the entire game and had a really great conclusion. Even if I'm not a fan of how they put Marie into the main story since it was very confusing. But that was my entire opinion on the story, so let's finally get to the other parts of the game. The combat of Persona 3 through 5 has largely stayed the same, so I don't really have too much to say about the core combat that already has been said in my Persona 5 video. Persona uses the one more system. If you hit an enemy's weakness, you get a chance to go again. And that brings a lot of strategy elements into it, as well as being faster paced than a lot of other RPGs. And sure, that doesn't apply to all of the bosses, but the normal enemy encounters go by way faster. But let's get into Persona 4 specifically. In terms of moves you can do, there's definitely a lot less elements than there are in Persona 5. There aren't any gun attacks, and there isn't psychokinesis or nuclear moves either. I mean, there are technically curse and bless moves in the game. In this game they're called light and dark, but the only purpose here is to serve as insta-kill moves. And the insta-kill moves in this game range from never working for most of it, into basically working every time when I used them in like the last few dungeons or so. I mean, you don't get a lot of insta-kill moves until Naoto joins your party, but even still, at least in Persona 5, you don't really get that many options for insta-kill moves, and mostly the curse and bless in that game features as its own element. But here, if your persona is weak to darkness or light, you can basically say goodbye most of the time. But to be fair, it is an older game, and to its credit, the combat's still very enjoyable, even if they don't have all the different kinds of moves. Surprisingly, even though it takes up your health, physical moves are always really powerful. Once I got one of the personas that had multi-hit physical attack, I'd basically kill any enemy I encountered. And while the game is most definitely easier than Persona 5, it didn't have any bullcrap bosses like Persona 5 did with the Okumura fight. But as a double-edged sword, Persona 4 doesn't have much boss variety with its different moves. And sometimes it ends up feeling like a very powerful normal enemy with a lot more health and battle quotes. So yeah, there's definitely less boss variety than there was in Persona 5. But before I talk about the party members themselves, I should mention that backup party members don't get any XP. So basically, when you choose who your main 4 is going to be, you gotta know for a fact that's who you're gonna go with. So unless you want to grind them up to the level you are at, which is exhausting as you get more and more party members that have to sit in the bench, you are basically just forced not to use them, even if they do get the best moves later on. And while that was definitely commonplace in a lot of RPGs back then, it's definitely not as good in compared to Persona 5, where even if you don't like using Morgana, he'll still level up and give you his best healing moves, so you don't have to hear him in battles and make for An for the 50 billionth time. But here, if you want to use all of Teddy's strong buffing moves and his high magic stat, you're gonna have to put up with all of his obnoxiousness if you want to do that. But now, let's discuss party members. Yosuke went through periods with me of being one of my best party members and one of my worst. At his best, he could do even more damage than the protagonist, but at his worst, he could be just a dedicated item user. So of course, I kept him in the entire game. Maybe sometimes he'd be essentially useless to my party, but the times when he was really good, he was really good. GA was the first party member I moved to the bench, so I don't really have as sound of an opinion on her compared to Yosuke. But after I played the game fully and realized how good physical moves were, I would probably use her if I had that knowledge going in. After I finished Naoto's dungeon, I had to decide whether I should cut Yukiko or cut Yosuke from my team, and of course I went Yukiko. Now I kinda wonder why I did that. Yukiko was definitely more consistent than Yosuke. She always did at least a decent amount of damage, and she has some good healing moves too. I'm just assuming at the time Yosuke was on one of his powerful streaks. Once he got on my team, he never left. When an opponent was resistant to physical, his lightning moves always did a decent amount of damage to combat that. And when they weren't, his physical moves did a buttload of damage. And he had power charge too, so he could always do 2.5 times the damage, which was insane, especially his multi-hit abilities. Teddy had a lot of moves that could buff the party, and he had a high magic stat, but he was also Teddy, so I didn't use him. And that's really all I have to say to that. The last party member you get is Naoto, who has a lot of similar moves to Akechi from Persona 5, which, since they're both nicknamed the Detective Prince, kinda makes sense why their moves are so similar. Obviously, since Akechi's one of the strongest party members you get, Naoto is one of the strongest party members you get in this game. But regardless of who I pick personally, there's not really a right or wrong party member. Just like Persona 5, a lot of the party members are very equal to each other in terms of their skill level, and I really appreciate that. Persona 4, just like Persona 5, has outfits you can equip for your characters that are alternate to what they usually wear, and I really appreciate that, especially in Persona 4, where your party members just wear their standard clothes, instead of Persona 5, where they have Phantom Thief outfits. The last thing I want to bring up is that I really appreciate the idle animation for the characters. They all give the characters a lot of expression and personality that I really appreciate. For example, Yosuke is listening to music, and Chie is basically dancing while preparing for a fight. And yeah, it's Persona, so it's kinda hard to make me not like the combat. I think the major difference between Persona 4 and Persona 5's gameplay is that the dungeons in Persona 4 are very different. Where most of the dungeons in Persona 5 were like Zelda dungeons where they had one layout and puzzles hidden throughout. Persona 4's dungeons are a lot different. All of Persona 4's dungeons are auto-generated, so there really isn't that much level design at work. It's basically just occasional enemies on the path and you need to get to a high enough level to face the next boss. There technically are sometimes puzzles, but the puzzles themselves aren't really that great. There's one in Yukiko's dungeon where you have to teleport around the floor and able to get to the part where you're supposed to go. But it's really annoying as every 5 steps you take, she'll teleport you somewhere else. So you basically gotta know what you're doing and where you're going, or you'll be stuck on that floor for a very long time. There's also one that requires you in Naoto's dungeon to go up to a previous floor to get an item that you need to progress, and that's really all there is to it. And those are really the extent of the puzzles that you're going to be getting. There's only really one dungeon that switches stuff up when it comes to the level design, and that is Marie's dungeon. Her dungeon takes away your weapons and items you've gained throughout the game away from the dungeon, and requires you to fetch whatever you can get in there, as well as taking away a buttload of your SP after you win a battle. There will also be floors in that dungeon where you have to open doors, and occasionally when you do, a shadow will jump out and fight you, which will cause your SP to drain more. Now, I definitely appreciate this dungeon for its uniqueness, but did I enjoy playing it through it? Absolutely not. It was definitely insufferable to happen to choose the wrong door and be forced to an enemy fight that I didn't want to. I suppose since it never really wanted to have dungeon design, I shouldn't criticize it for that, since that was really only a Persona 5 thing. But even still, I can't help but be a little bit disappointed with the lack of level design in its dungeons. What I really do appreciate though is unique theming for each dungeon based on the character it centers around. It's really just like Persona 5 in that regard, and it definitely distracted me from the fact that it was essentially just going through randomly generated levels. Some of my favorite dungeon designs are Mitsuo's dungeon, where you're inside an 80s RPG, the one where you fight the killer, where you're in the distorted version of the town, and of course the Heaven design, as I personally enjoyed the aesthetic of that the most. The really cool part is that you can actually visit these dungeons after you beat them, so you're not permanently locked out of going back to it if you want to grind or whatever. And there's even an optional mini-boss you can fight in each one. And that's really all I have to say about the dungeons. Since I decently like Mementos in Persona 5, I decently like the dungeons here. Obviously the main part was the combat in the dungeons, but I still enjoyed the dungeon design enough where it wasn't getting annoying by the end of the game. In my Persona 5 video, I didn't really cover how social links were structured, since I really didn't have anything to compare it to. But of course, now I've played Persona 4, and honestly, I kinda prefer how social links rank up in this game compared to Persona 5. There are drawbacks to Persona 4 style, mainly due to the fact that outside of your party members, you're not going to be getting any benefits to your social links other than extra experience when you fuse personas. But on the flip side, I noticed there's a lot less restriction on when you can do certain social links. In Persona 5, it was a kind of annoying thing sometimes when I would try to get a certain character ranked up, but I need to have a certain social stat maxed out or to a certain rank. In that game, it really sucked when confidants like Makoto's or Akechi's required a social link to be at a decently high level to start, and then sometime later in a confidant, you needed a completely different social link maxed out in order to progress it. And although I'll concede that that style is probably better than Persona 4's more simplistic style, I just prefer Persona 4 style because the social stats you need to rank up certain confidants are either the ones at night where you have a lot more time to rank up, or late in the game. And although non-party member social links don't really give you much out of an extra XP boost while fusing personas, but on the flip side, it also does give you a reason not to hang out with them if you really just don't like their character. So you can just continually ignore them throughout the game without really any consequence. And what's cool is that a few of the social links are structured differently than the norm. For example, the Fox social link levels up as you complete the side quests that the Fox gives you, and the end of Adachi and AI social link varies differently depending on your choices. But to cycle back on side quests, they're pointless. Outside of getting certain costumes or completing the Fox's social link, they really don't serve any purpose in the game. I mean, I guess you can do them, but rarely there's not much point to completing all of them. You don't really get any special reward that I know of. And it's not that any of the side quests are really that interesting, it's really just going into the Midnight Channel and finding some item from an enemy, or just finding something in the overworld and getting it to them. I mean, I guess it gives you more stuff to do in Inaba, but if you really want to spend a lot more time in there, you can just go to the Velvet Room and try to get all the personas in the Persona Compendium. Honestly, if just one day out of the blue they just took all the side quests out of Persona 4, I wouldn't mind or throw that much of a fuss over it. I wouldn't be happy that they're gone, but I also wouldn't care. I'm pretty sure it's been said before, but I really want to point out how nice of a hub Inaba is. Compared to the extravagancy of Tokyo in Persona 5, Inaba is a lot more laid back, with lots of less stuff to do. I mean, sure, there aren't any dart mini-games or jazz clubs, but let's be honest. How many jazz clubs in small towns do you know about? And since Inaba itself is a small town, it fits the setting really well. I don't have that many non-social link activities that I feel like bringing up, but there are a few I still want to talk about. First off, there's a shrine in every Persona game that lets you deepen a bond with a social link without even having to talk to them. But this time, it's also available at night, so it's definitely the most useful. You can also make lunch for a social link at home during the night, so that the next day you can increase your bond with them without even having to spend time with them. And I really appreciate that feature, as it gives even more possibilities to increase your bond with your social links. And when you get home, every social link you've maxed out, you have the ability to rewatch and choose different options. And that's really one of the best aspects of this game while comparing it to the other ones, as all Persona games have some really good social links in them, but this is the only one that lets you rewatch them without having to go to YouTube. And that's all the major stuff I want to talk about with the non-combat side of Persona 4. Now we're finally in the final stretch of this very long video, and let's continue it while talking about the characters. The cast to any long game such as this is very important. Any game that's trying to tell a story should really at least have a good cast for me to enjoy it. If the cast is well-rounded and likable and add to the content of the story, it will definitely bring up my enjoyment of a game, or in really good cases be added to the list of some of my favorite games. Or on the flip side, be so pointless and annoying that it brings down my enjoyment of an otherwise fun-to-play game. Luckily, Persona 4 definitely does not fall into that category, as most of the characters are great and are fleshed out. Let's start out with the first member of the main cast, Yosuke. Yeah, I really liked Yosuke. Yes, I admit that sometimes during the main story, Yosuke could be a bit annoying, but his character was still very likable. He had great motivation for why he wanted to stop the killer, since someone very close to him got murdered at the start of the game. That's character's motivation that not even the rest of the main cast has, since most of them are just doing it for the good of the town. He's also very logical and makes a lot of theories about the current state of the case. And his character fits really well as being the main character's best friend. Obviously he has flaws. Any character should in my eyes, but at the end of the day, he's still a really well-written character and definitely my favorite out of the main party. Chie was alright. She has her moments in the story, and in general she's pretty good, but she can definitely be pretty annoying sometimes. She can definitely be pretty over the top at times, but I don't know, maybe it's because I just finished playing a game with this character that I don't really mind. Yukiko, the first girl you save in the TV world, is at the same time the most and least reserved character in the entire cast. Most of the time she'll be quiet and keep to herself, but then she'll get in the fits of laughter that she can't control, but there will also be times where she acts a little crazy. That laughing thing in particular is a running gag throughout the entire game. I'd be lying to say if the joke hit well every single time it was done, but there were some times it was done well, and I definitely preferred Yukiko to Chie. Kanji was probably my second favorite party member. I already mentioned this in my story section, but the game did a really good job of subverting my expectations about Kanji's character. They make him seem like the standard thug personality, but in reality he's a nice guy. Kanji also had one of the strongest character arcs in the game. Similar to the game's main themes about introspection and learning to accept yourself, Kanji's character arc teaches him to not disregard his interests just to make people happy. And in the epilogue of the game, he ends up dropping his thug persona, if you will, since he no longer needs it due to all the improvements he made in his life. Teddy, on the other hand, there just had to be another Morgana. And you know what? No. Teddy transcends Morgana in being a terrible character. Morgana, he sims for one character. Teddy sims for at least 3. I'll admit there was like 2, maybe 3 times where I actually found Teddy funny, but those were isolated. He's also pretty creepy too. I'd understand if he was one of the villains, but no. He's one of the main party members. You know what? I like Morgana now. I've seen what Teddy has done, and now I want Morgana back. Please. Now, is he worse than this? Absolutely not. Nothing can be worse than that. Luckily, Rise is much better. I think she's most similar to Ann from Persona 5, but that similarity is mostly due to her temperament. When Rise is introduced, she leaves the idol industry as it is revealed that she doesn't want to work there anymore. She feels that people don't really see the real her since she's forced to play the Rosette role as part of her job. She realizes as you progress through her storyline that the Rosette side of her is actually a part of her and not just a role that she puts on. And it brings in a cool dynamic of her not wanting to go back to the idol industry but actually wanting to. I don't know, Rise is just a really solid character. Naoto is also a really great character. She is a detective, so like Yosuke, she makes a lot of theories about the case, and I always like that. Especially in the murder mystery, if a character can come up with many theories about the current state of the case, I'll definitely appreciate it. Compared to the more eccentric cast Persona 4, Naoto is pretty reserved. She's definitely a lot more shy, reserved, smart, and logical compared to some of the rest of the cast, which definitely helped her stand out even though she only joined the party late in the game. And yeah, Naoto's definitely up there as one of my favorite characters in this game. Keeping the good characters going, we have the pair of Dojima and Nanako. They're the pair that you spend the most time with outside of the main party members. And their storyline is one of the sweetest in the entire game. Their storyline centers around them trying to be a close family again. They both were strongly affected by Nanako's mother's death, so Dojima has to learn to be a better father. Since he is a detective, his job takes him away from Nanako all the time, but thanks to the help of the main character, he manages to find times to hang out with his daughter and become a better father. And I really like both of their personalities. Despite being a little kid character in a video game, Nanako isn't annoying at all. And I really like Dojima's kind personality. Marie, on the other hand, she's alright. Her personality and character development isn't anything mind-blowing. She's still a very solid character and her social link is pretty good, but comparing her to the rest of the cast, or heck, even Kazumi and Dr. Maruki in Persona 5, she definitely doesn't stand out as much. Now at last we've reached the best character in Persona 4. If you watched this whole thing so far, you probably already know who I'm going to say, but he's the last member of the main cast and we ended on a good one. It is the murderer! Yay! Yeah, Adachi's unironically my favorite character. Yeah, Adachi's one of the most likable characters in the entire game. Well, at least until he revealed he started killing people. Before you find out that he's the killer, he's likable, he's pretty funny, and he's relatable in some ways. But of course, that's all a charade, because in reality, he's crazy, bored, and he thinks he deserves more than what he got. In a flip of a switch, he goes from a likable guy you kind of want to cheer for, to a despicable madman you want to destroy. A flip I really appreciated, because if he was given sympathetic qualities, it would kind of damper the feeling of beating the serial killer. So yeah, Adachi is definitely the best character in the game. And that's the end of the main cast. All of them minus Teddy are really great characters, and I definitely like them a lot. There are some great side characters too, but to prevent this video from becoming longer than it already is, I'll avoid talking about them. For now. In the final section of this video, I just kind of want to mention some stuff that doesn't really fit into any of the previous sections. First off, just like Persona 5, this game is extremely stylish. Persona 4 goes for a colorful TV design, whereas Persona 5 went for more of a comic booky design. Obviously, this game came out around 13 years ago for the golden version, so it's not as detailed as Persona 5, especially in the character model design, whose mouths don't move at all when they're speaking, but I don't really fault it for that. It is an old game, and the game still looks really gorgeous. Yeah, the Persona soundtracks are quickly becoming some of my favorite ever, and Persona 4 definitely delivers. To list some of my favorites, I really like Specialist, the school theme, Signs of Love, the theme when you're at home at night, and the version of the I'll Face Myself song when you're fighting Marie. And of course, my favorite song in the entire game, Heaven. Persona 4 also has a TV listings feature where you can watch old cutscenes from the game, listen to music, and you can even play a quiz minigame with Teddy. It even has a cool Midnight Channel Easter egg if you're playing the game at midnight. It might not have all the features as Persona 5 Thieves Den, but it's still really cool all the same. And with that, we have reached the end of the video. For my closing thoughts, Persona 4 is an amazing game. I don't like it as much as Persona 5, but Persona 4 is still a very amazing game. It has great characters, a great story, and a great location for the game to take place in, and an amazing soundtrack to go on top of that. But with all that being said, thank you so much for watching this video. When I made my 30-minute video about Persona 5, I honestly did not expect it to be that long. When I made a 46-minute video about Persona 4, I definitely did not expect it to be that long. I'm excited to give you my opinion on Persona 3 when the time comes, but that will be in a couple months. And honestly, with the knowledge of the other Persona games, I could make another video about Persona 5 if I really wanted to. But only time will tell. Again, I want to thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you all next time.